you for waiting. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the RJ session. Today we're going to learn about reproductive justice, or RJ, South Asian RJ history, and do an activity to visualize our advocacy together. I'm especially excited for this session because so many of our individual members indicated that RJ is a priority for them in this collective in 2024. And in response to that feedback, we created an RJ organizing pod. So this is a quick little plug. If you're interested in learning more or signing up for the pod, let us know. You can check out the links in the chat to find meeting dates, pod member expectations, a description of the work that we'll be doing. And to make it really short, this pod will basically publish a campaign in June about having intergenerational conversations around RJ. And today's session is a really great primer for this campaign. So if you have fun during the session, which I'm sure you will, the RJ pod might be a really good fit for you. And I made Shakti give me the screen share because I wanted to show off a little collage I have on this next slide. But your session facilitators, Sarah and Shakti, are two absolute powerhouses in the RJ world who fight fiercely for repro rights and accessibility, and also who make me laugh endlessly. They're going to share more on their backgrounds in the presentation. So I just wanted to share a bit about what I love about them. So Sarah is a full spectrum doula who quite literally carries community care wherever they go. I'm not exaggerating. Sarah's truly stocked up on Narcan, Plan B, and more, and it's in a little pouch wherever they travel to. They also wear the most relevant shirts and practice exactly what they preach, which I absolutely adore. And Shakti is an advocate who is always ready to bring people together and into the movement. She excels at campaigning, challenging others in the field, and celebrating wins. I can really hear her scream in this one photo and a recent win that she had, which maybe she'll talk more about. But basically, they both go so hard for youth rights, for communities of color. They aren't afraid to call out contradictions in the movement, and they challenge everyone to embody RJ's values just as they do. I love them, and without further ado, I'll pass it off to Sarah and Shakti.
What?
Now you can take over screen sharing.
Wait, I just hope it doesn't kick you out again, but please know I do love you if it does kick you out.
I'll be back if it does.
Okay. How am I supposed to focus after you just emotionally wrecked us with such sweetness? Yasmin did leave out the most important part about myself, which is that I am Yasmin's cousin. That is my claim to fame. Thank you. I would like to thank my parents for absolutely nothing with that. But yes, hi everybody. Welcome to our Reproductive Justice Within South Asian Communities presentation, interactive chit chat vibe. I am sharing my screen, so I will not be able to see the chat, and that's where homie Yasmin is going to uplift things. But I just wanted to see if also Sarah's pinned as well, because shout out my baby girl. That's my baby girl. Love Sarah. So just to kick it off, I guess he was very sweet with introducing us. And I can just go first since I'm already off mute. My name is Shakti. I love that I'm in a space where I do not need to give the phonetic pronunciation, but if you are concerned for some reason, I guess people like to say shuck and Arab corn and thee. I'm an abortion storyteller, which is another way of saying I've had an abortion, and I use my story as a tool for advocacy and connection. I'm a disruptor. I am that person that will piss off the family during holidays, but it's for a great cause. I've done a lot of lobbying, which is working to persuade legislators on specific pieces of legislation. A testifier, Plan B distributor, soon to be abortion doula. I just started my training this morning, so I'm so excited because I'm on my journey to become a full spectrum doula, really just trying to be like bestie Sarah. Sex educate, so a former health promotion writer, and I'm a board member of Abortion Fund of Ohio, which is Ohio's only statewide abortion fund. And I would say I am a nurturer as well, or as I like to call myself now, a little chicken tender, which is ironic because I'm vegetarian, but I'm a tender because I am the biggest marshmallow softie, and I also come to life tending to the people I love. So that's a little bit about me. And then before I quickly jump into other things for Sarah to also introduce herself, just also want to say that something about me and how I do my little presentation work is I'm just going to say fuck any ideas of white supremacist professionalism. I will gladly cuss and make jokes and show my personality. If, of course, cussing for some reason for anybody feels the least bit uncomfortable, please let anybody on the SOAR team know, and then they can just DM me to shut the fuck up. Beyond that, would also encourage people to get cozy. It's pretty late on a Sunday, so feel free to get comfy. I have on little bunny shoes, My dog is right there. And in also decolonizing this workshop, I will admit that I hit the bowl before doing this presentation. So shout out, we're a bit more focused. And then, yeah, Sarah, jump into it for your little intro.
I don't know how I can go after that. Honestly, that like just sums it up. I feel like we're all on the same page now. We're all on the same page. Um, but similarly to Shakti, I am a self-managed abortion trainer, an abortion storyteller, Plan B distributor, full spectrum doula, but mostly how I came to become those things, which I can talk about a little bit later, is because I'm just a family member, a person in a community, a daughter, a cousin, an auntie, just someone who exists. And for South Asians, that's the fabric of our identity. And so for me, that's like kind of the core of why I do this work.
And I have the biggest little girl crush on Sarah. So the fact that we're doing this presentation is so cool. Also, before I forget, I just want to give a huge shout out to the SOAR team for this, because Sarah and I, in prepping this, had multiple conversations about how this summit is something that like little us dreamt of and like didn't know would be a thing that we could do. So the fact that I'm in a kurta doing a presentation with someone I so deeply admire who's from the community for a group that is a shared community, shared values. This is like one of our little pinch me moments. So thank you for this. And yeah, shout out. Okay, now we're going to jump into it. This is what I mean. I'm a chicken tender. But y'all are great. So our roadmap for today, and I will try to follow Himadri's guidelines and speak slower. I can get excited and speak quickly. So we will be grounding ourselves in reproductive justice. We know that folks have already talked about the overviews of what the tenets are. We'll be connecting that very specifically to South Asian history. We'll do a very brief recap of South Asian power within the reproductive justice space, and that will be connected to SOAR partners. And again, I say brief recap because the SOAR team has been pretty incredible with compiling a ton of resources and community for folks. But it's also good to be grounded in the fact that we have a space and we have a voice in this movement, and we should be leveraging it and building upon that. We'll also talk about South Asian perceptions and attitudes towards reproductive justice issues. And given that a lot of the root of attacks on reproductive healthcare access, all of that tends to stem from anti-abortion beliefs and rhetorics, we will be having a specific focus on abortion advocacy as well. And then we'll talk a little bit about what our reproductive justice advocacy has looked like. Again, just re-emphasizing what folks within our communities are already doing, and that we would love to build more connections, have more homies around, and that we're also colleagues for a lot of you all. So again, with Sarah being a full spectrum reproductive doula, all the things that they are, and me with any part of anything I've ever done that could be the least bit interesting to any of you. So that's what we'll be doing. And if you see me looking this way, it's because I have my laptop and two screens behind me. I am paying attention. And yeah, so to start in grounding ourselves in reproductive justice, am I going too fast? Okay, great. I'm just excited. So grounding ourselves in the reproductive justice demands. These things we know, right? So we're going to talk about this human right to autonomy over our bodies being the very core of all of it, the right to have children, the right to not have children, and the right to parent children in safe and sustainable communities. And so I am curious for folks how this connects with your cultural values. When you hear reproductive justice broken down this way, what were things that you grew up with as values? How does this relate to those? Or maybe values that you had to unlearn and then form new ones? Just curious. I think someone just came off mute, and you're welcome to do that. I just cannot see because I'm sharing the screen. And this is where I'm going to lean on Sarah to read the chat because I can see it popping off, but I don't want to
Yes. So
That's what
here,
the
yes, I was just like putting my little sparkly heart emoji on everything because I love it. But what we're getting in the chat is that I should have children and I need to be married. South Asian and most immigrants absolutely, the absolute love parents have for their children. Yes, parents loving their children, how we have children, a community that's centered in raising children and taking care of one another and helping to make sure that needs are met. And then, okay, we just got a nice little chunky one. Let me read it. The kinship over stranger support system. Love that. That comes up a lot in this presentation. Access to a village. Oof, resonating so strong with me right now. Choice has felt like a cultural taboo. That's also very resonating with me right now.
also
More safe. Yes.
whoever said the expectation that we have children, I did not know I signed up to be personally attacked, but thank you. That was actually pretty on the nose. Not someone asking me if I didn't think it was my duty to have children, and I said, so
I think we're getting some good stuff about how children are treated as an oppressed class and how that intersects for us with GBV and family violence, the pressure to have boys. Yeah, this is a slightly different cultural experience, but the not to give into hookup culture. Need I say more? Um, yes, and you're incomplete if you don't want or have children. I feel like maybe you guys should be leading the presentation, but um this is this is amazing to read, and I'm really happy to see that a lot of this is coming up in the information that and resources that we have to share.
100%. And it's also interesting because, again, we can contextualize this. When we think about reproductive justice in the US, a lot of times we think about mainstream culture, which typically will center cis, white, middle class women. Their names may or may not be Karen, and that's fine. But we don't typically get to hear more about our own experiences and our own stories. And I think contextualizing that with what some of our experiences are, because even to what folks were talking about, they're very specific cultural experiences that we can have that may be shared. But I can tell you, having conversations with my white friends, for example, that there is just far less of a conversation around the sex assigned at birth, right? That of any kid that you may or may not have, and also how those conversations tie into any other conversation about reproductive justice, including something like abortion or giving birth or parenting. So thank you. And, I'm not going to harp on this actually for too long, but I think it's also just worth stating that we're just constantly seeing far more and more attacks on reproductive justice, and not just solely from the lens of actual pregnancy rights. So a lot of us are familiar with what's happening with the Alabama Supreme Court ruling, which is essentially saying, LOL, these little IVF shebangs are full humans. With obviously the goal of that to be what we call establishing moral personhood, or it's just a fancy way of saying, if you say that a embryo or fetus has the same rights as a full-blown human being, then you are just trying to set the foundation to have many more anti-abortion rulings and things like that. And then that is, again, why we tend to focus on abortion, because now attacks on abortion have now harmed IVF. They can harm things like contraception, which is why we see attacks on things like emergency contraception, and all of that. But again, it is very much contextualized to our own communities. And beyond that, when we think of it as a global framework, I like to say that reproductive justice as a global framework truly should be a white feminist's worst nightmare, because this should be a movement that is led by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, especially people who are assigned female at birth, who are having distinct experiences that have been historically oppressed. And again, this is the whole point, that we're trying to constantly center historically oppressed communities. I I'm just going to say something with complete candor that one of the reasons why I'm so grateful for the SOAR space is because I'm in a room with folks who are more likely to share certain experiences, which includes not being recognized or having our experiences being validated or erased. And now we get the space to dominate the conversation. And I also want to put a little brief note on this because Sarah did mention the slut shaming culture. That also a key part of reproductive justice that I think is pretty crucial to talk about when it comes to South Asian communities as well, is that it has to be combating this puritanical culture. Because a lot of the harms and the oppression that we will face when it comes from a reproductive justice angle tends to come from this idea that the acceptable way in life is to, first of all, for a lot of us, I don't know how many of you are also raised with this idea of you're not supposed to date, you're not supposed to look at a boy. For me, shout out to my parents when they found out I was queer. So I couldn't look at a boy, but somehow was supposed to like go through school, get 20 masters at 25 years old, somehow find a nice Indian Hindu man, settle down, have children by 26, 27, 28, be done by 30, all the things. And I was like, sorry, Ravi and Asmita, that's not going to happen, but shout out to you. And they've been very supportive. But it's also been very fascinating for them to see how I navigate the world right now. Again, like I've said, I've had an abortion, and that was when I was having sex that was outside of marriage. Not that I was married and cheating. That sounded weird. I was not yet married. And also I threw another spicy one their way and I married a white man. And then I divorced a white man. But this puritanical culture is very interesting when we do this work because there's so much slut shaming that goes into it. When I do a lot of abortion advocacy, there's a lot of like, but why do people need to keep having sex? Or when I talk about contraception or sex ed or sexual violence prevention. And at the end of the day, every single person is looking to feel seen, heard, and understood and build connections with people. And one of the ways that people can build those connections is through physical and sexual intimacy that can have other implications and consequences, many of which are delicious and filled with pleasure. So as we also talk about reproductive justice today, please know that Sarah and I are coming at it from a very full, holistic framework. We're not thinking of it as like just combating the negative in terms of combating sexual violence or unwanted pregnancies or unfavorable birth outcomes or rearing. It's also about the positive. Like we deserve to lean into the positives of having this agency of experiencing pleasure and joy and connection in life. So with all of that, how do you all feel an RJ framework can allow us to foster connections across movements? And you can talk about something serious like pro-Palestine or disability justice or anything, and you can find any other movements too that you want to connect with. It doesn't have to be that serious. Yes, Miss Ma'am Marie Khan.
At you, not to take the example of you saying Palestine, but that not like, let's even say pre-October 7th, like.
No, please be very pro-Palestine. We welcome it. I say you just don't have to if you don't want to.
But like your first point here, a white feminist's worst nightmare. And that's what I'm seeing at a nonprofit, which is part of an industrial complex unto itself, that people are taking up space that it's like, you cannot, you shouldn't have been here. If you're a Zionist, you literally should not have been here. You should have somehow been flagged that you are at odds with this. And now trying to show and educate people like, no, this isn't RJ being changed or twisted. This is literally what it's meant and has been. And that part enrages me because I'm like, this should be like straight up, and this should be obvious to anyone, the intersectionality of this. And I know it's rooted in so much xenophobia, Islamophobia, so much, but that part in particular, the white feminist piece, enrages me because they're changing the narrative in a space, like they're changing a thing they have no right to change or alter.
not me being muted. I said, you left no crumbs. But if anybody else in the class would like to add to that, please feel free.
So in the chat, we have someone sharing that the RJ framework is holistic and rooted in the material conditions and root causes of violence being systems of oppression. Wow, love a good materialist Marxist analysis on my Sunday afternoon. That literally takes me back to dialectical materialism when I was like a scrubby little teenager. But that is what really is the core, is the material actual conditions that people experience, which is why it's so necessary for RJ to be a space to connect movements, because at the core, many of us have come from movement spaces that we see need more that RJ has to offer. Yasmin just shared that in Chicago, RJ was used as a framework to mobilize communities to defund the Chicago Police Department because of the last pillar, or the fourth pillar of RJ, which is the right to parent children in safe and sustainable communities. Love that.
Love. I can also say that I shared a bit about doing political advocacy earlier on. And as much as my focus was on things like sex ed, access to services, all of that, I also did a whole lot of work around queer and trans affirmation, because that is reproductive justice. I also would do work around housing justice and testify against unlawful evictions or code violations or things like that. And so for me, I have found my home in the reproductive justice movement. I truly love it. I say I found my home when I completely mentally erase every single white feminist who has ever stressed me out. But if anybody wants to collect them, please feel free to do that. But I truly have found my home here. And also to say that to anybody here, anything that you are so deeply interested in is so intimately connected to reproductive justice that there's always going to be these connections. So I love to also think about that. But that was our little like grounding and reproductive justice. And now I do want to transition us a bit to exploring some of the long history of violence against South Asians, because it does anchor into our ability to live a life that is more in line with the tenets of reproductive justice values. And again, we're looking at this at the nexus of reproductive health, gender, and our culture. Also want to say a little shout out, because I do hate speaking in passive voice, that when I talk about this long history of violence, we are primarily talking about the violence that comes at the hand of white colonizers. So shout out to those colonizers. And by that, I mean not. So I'm going to pass it over to Sarah, who will be sharing more. And then Sarah, you can just let me know when you want me to do next slide.
Thank you. Yay. Okay, so we're going to talk briefly about what bodily autonomy means to South Asians. And we're taking a snapshot right now of about the past 400 years, because the past 400 years for South Asians were perhaps arguably the most transformative. The largest mass migration in human history happened as a result of partition, which happened as a result of the end of England owning us. And so also want to say, because I realize we didn't include this, and I know that this is included, but in this context, when we're saying India, we mean all of South Asia, because this was the historical boundaries of the East India Company. So this includes parts of Sri Lanka, Bengal, Pakistan, etc. But I wanted to mention that because that is important. So there was a very long period of time right after actually the Portuguese left, and when the British were like, we want to take your tea, and they forced South Asians from their homelands to work under the East India Company rule, and they ended up bringing these communities to all over the world, essentially different parts of East Africa, parts of the Caribbean, parts of West Africa. And this is actually how the first South Asian diasporas became a diaspora was actually by South Asians not experiencing the right to bodily autonomy and by being forced to become laborers and being forcibly removed from their homelands. So we have to provide this context too of people being dispossessed from their homelands as something that is necessary to having bodily autonomy. Can you do the next slide, please, Shakti? Thank you.
Yes, and also a great time to say a reminder, Free Palestine.
Yes. Free Palestine. So the second tenet of reproductive justice is the right to have children. And across time, in the 400 years that we're talking about, this hasn't always been guaranteed for South Asians, but specifically in the past 100 years, we've seen the advent of technological advancements related to sexual and reproductive health weaponized against South Asians in the name of public health and population control. For example, in the 1970s, there was a compulsory vasectomy sterilization program that sterilized, I think it was close to like 200,000 men from villages that were considered to be poor and down. And I don't remember the exact terminology that they said, but I know it's really racist. So that's why I'm not wanting to think of the exact word that they said. Similarly, we saw that many South Asian children were forced to leave their homes and to attend, British and European style boarding schools because being raised in their communities actually posed a great moral, spiritual danger to British Empire because of the importance of our kinship connections and how we, give knowledge to our descendants, essentially. And there's also been a history of cash incentivized government sterilization programs related to tubal litigation. And that would be for somebody that would be assigned female at birth, the government would provide financial compensation for tying the tubes, which is eugenics. This is practiced in the United States. We've actually seen a lot of South Asian women and people who are assigned female at birth forced into tying their tubes in relation to criminal cases, and that some DAs will actually like negotiate this as a part of a plea deal or as a part of a sentencing agreement, which kind of goes to show that the law has always been used against us, regardless of our existence in our homelands in the diaspora, which is really concerning, which is why reproductive justice is so meaningful to us. Next slide, please.
Yes. Can I just quickly add to that, tied to the right to have children, which also ties into like the right to how we raise our children, something that we also typically don't talk about as much here is the ways that white colonizers would force South Asians to get rid of their culture, erase it, including when they had children. So specifically for me, I'm a Jamaican Indian. I do have descendants who were indentured laborers. And my dad, his name is Ravi Clifton Rambarran, but when he was born, it was Clifton Ravi Rambarran. And the same thing for my grandfather. His name is Vishnu Clifford Rambarran, but when he was born, it was Clifford. And it was just those seemingly little ways of forced assimilation that really led to folks getting really stripped of their culture. And it again impacted the ways in which stripping that culture impacted their ability to have children or not have children or have the children that they envisioned in their hearts and prayers, if that also makes sense.
Yeah, like on a personal note, for example, my dad went to one of these British style boarding schools, the public school system that many young children were forced into in South Asia after partition. And what I've seen is that it's created like actual generational trauma, very similar to the parallels of Native folks who had family that were in Indian boarding schools where they were forced to assimilate to Western cultures, only speak English. They weren't allowed to cook their cultural foods, in their own homeland. Similarly, the state of Israel has forced sterilization upon non-white ethnic Jews, Ethiopian and Mizrahi, and other ethnic Jewish communities who have less rights because the law and medicine works so that they aren't able to have children in the way that they deserve. Thank you. So the last tenet is the right to parent in safe and sustainable communities. And I think we all know that we probably aren't living in the most safe and sustainable communities right now. We are under-resourced, underfunded, strapped for time, capacity, and that didn't start 10 years ago. It didn't start 20 years ago. It started hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago when colonizers came to occupy our lands and subjected our people to great oppression. And that intergenerational trauma and impact of white supremacy cannot be understated as a barrier to South Asians thriving and being able to parent our children in safe communities. We see this obviously at the intersection of gender-based violence and family violence. And as people who know intimately what that looks and feels like, thinking of that lasting impact in our bodies is something that I often try and think about us being able to release because it's not ours to hold. South Asian parents have not been able to engage in cultural breast and chest feeding practices where when Western health institutions were implemented. For example, Nestle and a number of other baby formula companies promoted illegally the use of formula in NICU wards and to new parents. And so they weren't able to establish breast or chest feeding and then had to rely on buying formula and using water that was known to be unsafe for infant consumption. And so that's actually how a number of public health problems have been perpetuated, is by attempting to control parenting in South Asia. And similarly, a survey that SOAR actually has featured on the website. Yes, Nestle is also on the BDS list too. Fuck Nestle for a lot of other reasons too. But a lot of South Asians experience physical abuse, economic abuse, immigration-related abuse, and emotional abuse from our own family members at times. And so I think that just demonstrates that we have the most to gain from adopting a reproductive justice framework.
And also just to like really anchor this in too, because I didn't put this part in the slide, the connection with all these kinds of violence and the right to parent is also like, for a lot of people, they may be scared to become a parent when they're experiencing all of these harms. We know that there are multiple reasons why people may have, for some, like an example, an abortion. That's just one way that gender-based violence and reproductive justice can intersect with one another, as well as, to Sarah's point, all the intergenerational harm, multi-generational harm, all the harms, all the capital H harms and capital T traumas. So yeah.
Yes, someone in the chat said, my experience with the legal system in the US has shown deep bias against breastfeeding in the case of the South Asian community. That's something that I've noticed a lot as a full spectrum doula, and I hate it. I'm actually trying to become a certified lactation consultant and would like to become an internationally board certified lactation consultant because breastfeeding and chest feeding is like the most South Asian thing. I feel like I just knew everyone in my family was raised that way. And it's very disturbing to see the coercion and lies that are told to new parents.
And when they're rooted in a puritanical culture, because titties are
Yes.
just blobs of flesh.
Yes,
Blobs of
and
flesh.
when they're postpartum, because like that whole exploitation piece of it is something that very much bothers me as a doula. And then the right to not have children in a South Asian context. So these slides are not chronologically ordered, and I actually did that intentionally because at the core, every modern tool that is used to kind of execute systems of oppression and power against South Asians in our bodies is connected to the history of white supremacy and colonialism. It is because of our colonial history that these stereotypes have not only survived, but they've become the norm of practice and understanding in healthcare and in medicine, specifically related to sex-selective abortion bans, which are currently adopted in at least 14 states in the United States and in both Pakistan and India. What this means is that incorrect, completely racist information was presented as fact and now impacts the ability of millions of people to access healthcare in a country that this research isn't even coming from. What this looks like is South Asians in Pakistan and India and many of the states in the United States are unable to obtain gender confirmation or gender diagnostic ultrasounds because of this racist idea that South Asians inherently do not value girl babies and that we as a people are suspicious. That is the problem. That's the real problem. Last year, I was a part of the team actually when this happened. SOAR launched the ACG, which is the first actual resource, like not just in the United States, not just in the Western world, like literally in the entire freaking globe world, to put together accurate, evidence-based, linguistically and culturally relevant information about obtaining abortions. The fact that a little nonprofit really did that one too, and like we were literally in 2023 and it was just a bunch of us on our computer going beep, boop, 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 that amazes me. But again, it also shows us that like when we work together, it's so awesome what we can achieve. And something I also find that is written out of our history is that when the East India Company ruled our homelands and occupied our homelands, there were many South Asians who were forced to bear children to those people. And that distorted our kinship networks and systems because for the first time, relatively in our history period, there was the institution of a white man who had control over a child, and he didn't even live there. He was in England. He was posted up in London, while there was a beautiful little brown baby running around somewhere in Calcutta. That is another tool of control that's used in paternity cases, in cases where divorce or dissolution of marriage happens. And that's another tool that's used against people to create suspicion and essentially to destroy our family systems. That's kind of what it comes down to at the end of the day. Next slide, please. I think we're gonna skip.
We're gonna be skipping our music breaks, y'all.
Yeah.
Sorry, but you can listen to them in your own time. So. Okay, I'm happy to take it from here. So now we just had our overview of the reproductive justice tenets and how they relate with South Asian history. Of course, there's so much that we could share, but Sarah was really skillful at synthesizing a bunch of relevant and connected information to highlight these journeys with you all. And so now we're going to be exploring abortion advocacy through a culturally informed reproductive justice framework. I hope that this doesn't feel a little bit like whiplash. This is also one of the reasons why we did the tenets a little bit out of order and ended with the right to not have children. And just as a little note, I'm not going to be showing any images or videos of abortions. We will discuss to some extent gender-based violence, sex selection, and inclusivity. And I also don't no, I don't think that there would necessarily be certain content warnings that I would need to give, but I just wanted to flag that for folks. But before I jump in, do folks have any burning questions? Because I realized that we just covered quite a lot of valuable history. And so if folks have questions for Sarah, I would like to just pause there. I always feel like this is where I have elevator music in my head, but I am seeing the chat now going off, so I don't know what's going on.
Yasmin said that they're still processing this information, which I think is kind of where that's a good place to be. These slides will be available to you, and like, you know, we're not gatekeeping. You can have access to this and come back to it at a later time.
And we'll chat with folks anytime.
Yes. Oh, yeah, we will definitely do that.
Our goal with this is to give you some context within South Asian history and culture, especially because something that Sarah and I talked about that we struggled with in our journeys as reproductive justice advocates is feeling like we were so skillful and knowledgeable talking about so many other communities who should be anchored and centered in conversations around reproductive justice, including, you know, Black and Indigenous communities. But there was some sadness and shame that came with not feeling like we were grounded enough in our own cultural and historical experiences. So that's part of what that is. And every time Sarah talks, I'm like, damn, I'm obsessed with you. Okay. So now we're going to jump into just exploring some abortion advocacy. And we will be starting with just talking through some perceptions and attitudes towards abortion. I just realized, Sarah, that the next two slides are yours. If you wanted to unmute for a brief overview, go for it. Baby girl.
Yes, sorry, I was just responding in the chat, but okay. How do South Asians feel about abortion access? The truth is, we didn't really seem to have like any thoughts at all about abortion until the British criminalized it while we were under colonial rule, which is the same time they criminalized our kinship structures, homosexuality, basically any kind of unique cultural aspect of our communities that gives us power and strength. Yes, colonizers would love me. Yes, colonizers made the gender binary. In this case, we know that basically everyone was having abortions, from elite wives, aka, you know, the white feminists, to women in public health roles. People were seeking abortions in South Asia in the later 19th and 20th century. It became criminalized in 1962. And in 1963, a number of British nurses were transported to various colonial hospitals so that they could oversee the obstetrical units to essentially surveil people that were suspected of having an abortion, which is called racism. So let's just make that really clear. Like, having white people come to our homeland to judge or try and ascertain whether a person has had an abortion is a form of white supremacy and violence. Next slide, please. And the people who were doing these abortions or supporting these abortions, you might say, well, they were described as being a hag of low caste, being evil, and basically a witch nonetheless, right? We could just talk about that whole thing forever, but what that meant is that South Asians have always held abortion history in the hands of Dai, who are our traditional reproductive sexual healthcare practitioners that often assist with childbirth, the immediate postpartum period, and preconception planning. And they rely upon a combination of Western and traditional methods to support people. And it was through this this narrative of them being evil that abortion simultaneously became associated with moral evil. And obviously, with the insertion, control, alt, copy, paste of Christianity and Christian values, that became something that a person in society would be held to. Next slide, please. So, like I said before, basically everyone in South Asia was having an abortion. This literally, it really didn't matter what religion or what religious background or affiliation you were a part of, which is so shocking because religion can be so divisive in our community and has historically been. But we know that across the board, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, and Jain communities support abortion access. And the fact that we're all actually able to be on the same page about this blows my mind because we're so unable to be on the same page about so many other things. But this should show us that access to healthcare is a fundamental South Asian value. Next slide, please. Also, if someone wants to screenshot this, post it, please do. I put this little thing together and I love breaking it out to myth bust about religion, because we can also talk about religion when we talk about abortion.
Yeah, and I also was a little excited that I maybe made 2 little Instagram stories for people if they wanted to share.
Yes.
Okay, amazing. And so also the reason that we are highlighting how South Asians feel about abortion access is because when we ground our advocacy, a huge thing that is a huge tenet or value that a lot of our families hold is family honor. So raise your hand if you have also been personally victimized by the question, what will auntie say? Fuck auntie in that way, if that's what's happening. But no, when we talk about family honor and everything, Divya said, me?
We have a hand raise.
Yeah, I was actually like, are you raising your hand because you were also victimized or because you want to say something? Because either one is great.
It's both because it's a conversation that I deal with working with South Asian clients on a daily basis, because a lot of my clients have left their abusers. They're finally working towards a better future for themselves, but a lot of their decisions are kind of second guessed by their families because it's all, what will so and so say? So even though they're facing abuse and their families understand that they're facing abuse, they're still encouraging them not to seek a divorce or to reconcile with their abusers solely for the fact of what will so and so auntie say, or what will, like, the greater community say.
Yes. And love that you also said that. And I also very intentionally said the comment about the aunties, because actually to me, this is actually a really good segue to in talking about some of the connections between gender-based violence and reproductive justice. So on one hand, when we talk about where South Asians land when it comes to issues of reproductive justice, including and especially abortion, it's because as much as I want to be someone who can be annoyed and defensive and upset in the moment and just say, fuck all these aunties that are going to say shit to me, I also have to recognize that advocacy is persuasion. And part of that also means I have to understand where someone is at. I have to understand what's motivating their beliefs and their feelings and their actions, and then target that. And so now when I know that something that's such a key tenet in my communities is this concept of family honor and what will so-and-so say, one of the antidotes to those conversations is to say, well, let's talk about it. What will so-and-so say? Because actually, if you look at the data, if you listen to stories, if you talk with people about these issues openly, like Sarah's saying, you will very surprisingly find that there's quite a lot of agreement on this, which is impressive. And also, I think that there's something to be said about us having this cultural stereotype about aunties perpetuating all this harm, when again, that is to me a function of gender-based violence, because it is rooted in sexism that they have also been victimized by, that they are then perpetuating onto other people. And as much as we may not agree with it, some of that is rooted in their perceptions that will help you survive, right? So when there are, maybe let's say aunties who are putting a lot of pressure on, I'm just going to use gendered language here for a bit, but I obviously understand that everybody of all genders have abortions. When there's an auntie that's going to give that little daughter-in-law shit for maybe not having a son, yes, that is bullshit. They should not be doing that. And that is also rooted oftentimes in the harms that those aunties also experienced when they were not necessarily navigating their own reproductive journeys in line with all the rigid expectations that society held of them. So like these are quite the connections in my head, at least. And knowing this information, I think, is really helpful in combating some of that. And tied to that, when we talk about tips for abortion advocacy grounded in South Asian cultures, for me, these have been the three key things that have come up a lot that I have really had to ground in my own values. And so how do I talk about abortion when there's a lot of generational trauma around sex selection? How do I talk about abortion when it comes to trans inclusivity? How do I talk about abortion when it comes to South Asian patients and providers to, again, normalize the idea that this is a shared experience? And so, for example, just going specific to sex selection, which is going to be a very key topic that comes up anytime you talk about South Asians and abortions. I would say that the most basic things would be to also recognize that this is not a trivial preference. There's a lot of systemic discrimination at play, right? So a lot of times when people would be so concerned about you need to have a baby that is female assigned at birth, right? Or a quote unquote girl all the time, or you can't have that. You're supposed to have sons. That is because there's also this deeply felt and recognized and these held biases against girls and daughters and women. Also, and this may seem controversial to many people, but just to make my value clear, I believe that even if something could make me uncomfortable or make my eyebrow cock when it comes to reproductive justice or like abortion access, at the end of the day, I trust individual people to make the decisions that are right for them. And so if I'm also going to say that like someone can have an abortion because, you know, for whatever reason, they feel like they're not in a place to care for this child, they don't want to, all the things, I'm going to support that. And I recognize where there can be that contention within my cultural spaces when I'm having this conversation. But also to Sarah's point earlier, something we try to talk about is when you have any restriction or ban on abortion, what is also happening is that you're fueling a broader culture that is going to continuously chip away at access. And while we are talking about abortion, we are talking about abortion in part because it is the most attacked form of reproductive health care. That attacks on this affect all other forms of reproductive health care. And so when you have these restrictions and these bans, they're also not necessarily a guarantee that they're only going to quote unquote harm the people that they say that they're targeting. Because the reality of how these work is that doctors can just say, I suspect that this person wants an abortion. And it's because there's some degree of sex selection and they can deny care to that person. And surprise, surprise, we see this discrimination disproportionately harm Black and brown people. And then again, like I said, pro-abortion advocates trust pregnant people to make decisions that are right for them. But I think having this conversation around sex selection is really crucial. So just sharing a little bit of a personal story. I had an abortion 6 years ago. It was truly one of the best decisions I could have made. For myself, it was not a big deal. It was very straightforward. And having these conversations with my mother, I couldn't just go into that conversation just being like, hey, ma, had an abortion, love you, can you make me some tepla? I had to also recognize that it was probably going to bring up some feelings for her because my mother was a daughter where everybody wanted her to be a son. Like she was the daughter where her mother kept trying and trying and trying to have sons. And everyone then imposed on my grandmother that my grandmother must have been cursed because clearly the outcome is she's now having another daughter. So and for me, having conversations about abortion with my mother and all the proud abortion advocacy I do, and I'm very unapologetic with it, a conversation I have had to massage is how do I talk about sex selection with her? How do I talk about these broader cultural doings so that I can help to get her more on my page? And part of that also just goes into a general advocacy tool, which is you are trying to meet someone where they are at. You're trying to speak their language. And I'm not asking or telling anyone to compromise their values. I'm just saying, try to pay attention to what their values are and try to see if you can target them. And then similarly, I'm a very proud pro-abortion advocate, and I'm also that person that will, in my opinion, utilize whatever cis privilege I do have to also ensure that we are being very inclusive with how we talk about it. You will see that Sarah and I are being very mindful of the language that we're using even in this presentation. And so a little tool that was really helpful to me was to learn more about trans identities and experiences that are grounded in South Asian culture. And so, for example, Hijras being a really great community to learn about, and consider weaving in how colonialism is responsible for these restrictive gender binaries and expectations. Because again, to Sarah's point, that's where colonialism is the root of all evil. And even for me, for example, if I'm talking with my father, who's Trinidadian, who has descendants that are indentured laborers, and my father does not fuck with a goddamn colonizer, let me tell you that much. I mean, I don't know who does, but like it really pisses him off. He harbors a lot of rage around what they tried to steal from him and his communities. When I'm knowing that, and I'm also then talking about trans inclusivity, I'm able to then weave all these different values together to have these conversations with him. And it's actually made it so much more successful. And I will also add that this might seem a little bit random, but has been my experience and been the experience of many people. Many of us who are South Asian, who fall somewhere under the queer umbrella, whether it's with sexual orientation or gender identity, many of us have heard from our families when we have come out in some way that there's just this confusion because there's this idea that being queer or trans is almost like a white experience. My mother was so confused that she had a queer daughter that wasn't Ellen DeGeneres. And I said, ma'am, I know you grew up seeing Ellen DeGeneres and Anderson Cooper, but allow me to introduce you to Shakti Rambarran. We do exist. And so even with how I'm talking about inclusivity, and I'm really having to be intentional to learn about my communities to then have these conversations with my family, that these have been really helpful practical tools for me that I hope can also serve you as well. God damn, it's 6 o'clock. How the fuck are we running out of time? We're trying, y'all. There's so much good content. And then the last thing I'll say on this note is just, again, being anchored in the fact that we do have this collective power. And again, a little bit of an anchor to my story. When I had my abortion, despite the fact that I was already in this field, that I'm very open about these kinds of issues, I only knew of one other South Asian person who had an abortion at the time. And it was a pretty isolating experience at the time for me to have had my experience 6 years ago and feel like I didn't really have that many people who I could talk to within my communities. But something I found really supportive was that I actually had access to 2 abortion providers through my master's program. And one of them was Mira Shah, who is, I believe, a board member of SOAR. And she's fantastic. She's an abortion provider. But like, even just knowing that there are folks like us within this space helps with the advocacy, even at the bare minimum, to ground the advocacy in the fact that we're not isolated. I know it's 6 o'clock, Sarah, so I just want to pause and verbally ask my little how we would like to do these last 15 minutes. Because
So
I do
I
have
think,
some general advocacy tips too.
yes, so I think we're gonna postpone our activity. It's just a little worksheet. It's a little fillable worksheet. We'll send that home. So we'll continue with our slide, Shakti. I think we're just gonna,
Yes,
yeah,
amazing. Also,
maybe just,
I do be seeing my little chats. Don't worry, I'm seeing them.
yes. I think we'll just have to condense our story, our SOAR
Yeah.
partners, and just briefly,
Yes,
do that.
amazing. Okay, I'm not gonna go into this slide actually because I have them pretty clear on the slide, but general tips for advocacy, the general tips include fusing heart and mind, with the most basic way of explaining that to say, you just want to share stories and facts. And humans are emotional beings. We will respond so much more to stories than we will to facts. So if you feel like you're in a position where you need to choose, stick with a story. I say this also, sorry, having been the advocacy director for a statewide nonprofit. So that's part of my credential to talk about this. Having a clear ask, making engagement as mindless and easy for people to engage. So SOAR can do this a lot by like sending out these little like signups or petitions or this or that, make it mindless. When debunking myths, really try to have the fact be the more prominent part of that process because people tend to remember myths more. And again, as I've been talking about this whole time, really figuring out how to speak to someone's values, but also realizing when you need to pivot, because again, I'm not telling or asking anybody to compromise their values. So if you're trying to talk about being trans inclusive with repro access and people are being assholes and going off on a tangent that you don't want to entertain and you really can't, then you could be like, okay, well, for me, this is actually about XYZ, and then go there. I'm going to skip this slide too. I'm going to skip that little music break. And I'm actually going to speed through this, Sarah, so you don't even have to go into this, but we were just highlighting some of the orgs that have the South Asian representation within this movement, because again, the collective power is key to know and to build on. And again, there's a lot of us here in this space, but now I know that we have like 10-ish minutes, and I'm going to have Sarah go first. Sarah, actually, I think if you want to take the whole time, please feel free, because I'm obsessed with you, and I think that everyone can just listen to you talk.
No, I think maybe we could just go to your slide and then we can do it together and maybe start there and open it up for questions and kind of take the next couple minutes if that works with you.
Sure. So what this part was for y'all is that y'all could just have questions, like if you just had questions to ask us, because we've run into that a lot where folks are like, what do you do? How do you do it? Can I get involved? Or any questions that you may have. It's really just us repeating our bio in some ways to just give a reminder of things that we do. But yeah, if there were folks that had any questions or wanted to just chit chat about this.
I think something too that would be helpful to explain a little bit is like what a doula is. Like kind of just maybe breaking down some of these terms a little bit more, because when
I had my questions for you. I had my questions for Sarah. Sorry, I'll just start my question. Sarah,
yes.
what is a full spectrum doula, and what made you want to become a full spectrum doula?
Okay, what made me want to be? That's a good question. Okay. So a full spectrum doula, yes, is a person who's trained to support someone throughout the entire spectrum of pregnancy outcomes and reproductive health experiences. What that means is that they're trained to support a person who may experience a miscarriage, a stillbirth, some form of loss, a healthy delivery, anything in between. The reason why I became a full spectrum doula is because I very much felt that every single, you know, aspect and experience along the spectrum of pregnancy is important and valid. I learned so much through my family members' pregnancy experiences and my own. And what that means to be a full spectrum doula is that I typically support people as they're having abortions, either at home, in a clinic, in a hospital setting, in an outpatient setting, and during birth, either at the home, birth center, or hospital setting. So that's what full spectrum means to me. And I love it. It's something that feels very realistic to our community. We wouldn't, only show up for someone's abortion or only show up for someone's birth. We have to show up always.
Is there anyone here that's ever been interested in becoming a doula, or is a doula?
You totally should train as one. Okay, yes. Specifically an abortion doula. Okay, so I'm just gonna throw something out here. Amrita, this is for you. I am like super, super interested in us putting together a South Asian full spectrum doula training, because I see the need specifically for folks who work at the intersection of GBV and family violence, because there are legal specific intricacies and insight that you have that is really important in the context of pregnancy and childbirth and abortion. And I think that would be like really cool. So that's my last contribution that I have right now. And I would just like to thank everyone for being here and listening to us just talk about why it's awesome to be who we are and to be mammals who sometimes need to have bodily autonomy and assert control over our flesh vessels. So thank you
Oh.
all.
Why are you? Oh my God. Okay. That was perfect, Sarah. If anybody has any questions for Sarah or anything, we can just stick with Sarah. We do not need to go into anything about my little journey because I know we have 6 minutes to wrap up.
I'm so sorry. I don't want to burst the bubble. I think we have like about
No?
like 2 minutes to wrap
2
up.
minutes.
That's okay.
Perfect. Yeah, that's what I was
But-
saying. We're chilling there.
I can speak through the closing real quick, but does anyone have any questions? Yeah, we can give a minute for questions for sure, because I know you all gave such valuable information.
Do you want to share a little bit more on what the activity, like I know you just had the slide so that folks can do it on their own?
Yes, thank you, Amrita. So, Shakti, would you be able to screen share perhaps, just so that we can take a look at it and I can explain really quickly? It's a sun abortion pod map. It's meant to identify the different rays that can help bring sunshine to someone's abortion experience, specifically for South Asians. And there's examples of what different kinds of support can look like. There's 5 main buckets that I tend to reference and recommend for people accessing: emotional, cultural, physical, fiscal, and family support. And there's examples of what that could look like. Yeah. And I hope that people find it helpful to identify resources and tools that you can support your clients in, and the communities you serve, because really what this is meant to do is bring it specific to your community.
Yes. And one of the slides that I did skip through, part of what we were talking about is that support and advocacy really should be personalized when you consider your privilege and your strengths and all of that. And so with Sarah breaking this down as well, there are so many ways you can provide support. Maybe you can't drop $500 to someone so that they can get their care, but maybe you can order them a pizza. Let me tell you, a post-abortion pizza really hits. Or maybe it's just that you can show up and just say, hey, I see you, like, let's have these conversations. How are you feeling? Being a space where maybe you're now aware of the fact that more unique thoughts and feelings may come up. Those are the ways that we're looking to anchor it into this example. Maybe it could just be someone's needing access to care and you provide a heat pad, or you rub their backs, or you like watch their dog, or anything. So there's tons of ways to provide support. And again, this is currently specific to abortion access and care just because that was our example, but you could take this and use it for providing any other form of community care or mutual aid. And yes,
really
over
love
to
that.
you.
Yeah, no, you're good. Thank you all. This is a really great way to think about pod mapping. Like you said, Beta, like this is such a tangible thing to bring home. And for folks who are joining the RJ organizing pod, I'll actually make this like the take home assignment. So before our first pod meeting, I would love for you all to complete this, and then we can talk through it together and see how we can like weave it into our campaign. Think about it with like conversation guides with elders. I feel like sometimes talking about RJ can feel so daunting, but like giving folks really tangible things to do, including ourselves, is so helpful to like bring people into the movement and make it feel more like community. I know, homework. I don't want to be that person, but it is homework, but a fun kind of homework. So thank you, Sarah and Shakti, for creating it, for sharing your wisdom, your motivations, and your stories with us. It's amazing to walk away with so much knowledge. I always learn like so much when I talk to you both. And I would love for you all to show some love in the chat to Sarah and Shakti for being so vulnerable and being amazing and having such an engaging session with us. So as a reminder, you can reference that little pod sheet in the chat, but I'll also have it in the summit resources, and we can email it out later too. You can check out the summit resource goodie bag in the chat. Thank you so much for coming. There's a little Zoom ball that popped up on the screen, so you can take a couple minutes to finish that. And we'll be back in, I think, about like 3 minutes for the art making session. So see you all soon. Take a quick power break, grab water. And yeah, thank you again, Sarah and Shakti. We really love and appreciate you all.
Yasmin, you just spoke so quickly. You put that brown energy to use. You said,
I was like, we gotta go. People have to pee, people have to grab water.
Thank you all for coming. Sarah, thank you for being my dream co, and sorry, y'all are great. And let's keep in touch. Shout out.